With so many fantastic remasters and remakes of old PlayStation games popping up over the last several years, I think it's only logical to assume that Sony is going to continue to explore their catalog of older classics to translate into viable modern experiences. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again, I always prefer a new entry to a beloved series than just retreading the same ground, but the PlayStation catalog is nothing if not bursting at the seams with interesting IP, much of which holds up pretty well today, at least conceptually, and many of them would make great candidates to get that Sony remaster treatment. So here, I'm gonna go over some of those, explain why I'd like to see them remade, and what I think the likelihood is of that happening. The Ape Escape games are a no-brainer for this. They were extremely popular when they came out, they established a massive fan base with several sequels, and even had a few crossovers into other games over the years. Not many franchises can say that, especially from that era. Plus, they were sort of revolutionary with how they utilized the DualShock joysticks, which were very new at the time. Despite the fact that the franchise has been on ice for quite a while, the fan base is still pretty active, with lots of Twitter accounts and Facebook groups and Discord servers dedicated to Ape Escape. If Sony were able to pull this off, I think it would be a huge hit. There have been some rumblings that an Ape Escape remastered collection or remake might be in the works, so I'd say the likelihood of this happening is just about 100%. I would be shocked if we didn't hear some news about either a new Ape Escape game or a remastered collection by the next year or so. Now, the Gex games are a little bit more hit or miss for a lot of people, but personally I like them a lot, and I know a lot of other people do too, especially the second and the third ones, which were more 3D action platformers than the first one, which is a little bit more of a non-linear side-scrolling game. Playing these games now is a little rough. The camera is pretty shoddy in some spots, arguably worse than lots of other similar games on the PS1, but the fact that many of the levels are quite large and very explorable and offer multiple objectives would really help Gex stand among modern games in the same genre like Yooka-Laylee and A Hat in Time.
I am the greatest!
The 90s Ace Ventura style wisecracking and the Austin Powers references probably don't hold up too well for some, especially for people that were born after, say, 2000. But I think if they did bring these games back, they would have to keep all that stuff in there. It's just too big of a part of Gex's identity, for better or for worse.
You don't chop, baby, yeah!
I'd say the odds of this franchise coming back are probably relatively low. There's a lot more highly regarded characters that Sony probably wants to get to first, and I don't really blame them for that, I guess, but I also wouldn't say that Gex is out of the running either. Gex games have a ton of personality, and they're fondly remembered by quite a few people. I'd say we have a solid 50% shot at getting a remastered collection of these at some point, although probably not in the near future. Moto is a franchise that was pretty huge back in the day, and I'm very sad that nobody really talks about it anymore. Whenever you talk about racing on the PlayStation 1, generally people bring up Gran Turismo or Ridge Racer or Wipeout. People don't really bring up Moto anymore, and really that's just not fair because Moto was one of the best racers on the system and got better with every entry. Now, I know there's lots of mid-range AA style racing franchises out there right now, and that's a great problem for racing fans like myself to have, as there's arguably too many of them out there to even play them all. But there's just something special about Moto games that I think would make them stand out if we gave them that thorough remaster treatment, similar to what the Wipeout games got with the Omega Collection. Sadly, I have to admit, considering that these games are as obscure as they are, the odds of this ever happening are probably pretty low. I'd say probably 30% at best. But hey, we will still always have those original games if we want to go back to them, right? Crock and Crock 2 might come off as a little bit generic at first, and I suppose ultimately they kind of are, but once you really get into them, they really do feel like their own thing. The premise of Crock having to save the little gobos that raised him isn't really anything we haven't seen before, but I still really liked it. I don't know, I just can't explain why, it just works. The graphics and level designs were purposefully simplistic and really embraced the limitations of the 32-bit era, while many other games at the time were bending over backwards to hide them or overcome them. I always respected Crock for that. He knows what he is, he knows what his game is, and he doesn't try to be anything else. Just look at him. Perfection. The platforming is a little slower and more calculative than other games, especially because Crock actually sort of does have tank controls, and most of the levels were very open and simple, but because of all of that, Crock was able to avoid a lot of the camera issues that a lot of other 3D platformers had. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't perfect, and if it gets remade, they're gonna need some work, but since it was able to deal with a lot of that stuff by keeping a very pleasant, low-stress experience, it was perfect if you were in the mood for something like that. It has a very calming effect on you. Now, Crock 2 did mix it up a little bit, but largely I would say it still fits in very much with the first game in terms of its tone and the way it feels to play. Now, I do fear that because of how uninspired Crock 1 and 2 sort of seem on the surface, I feel like that's sort of how they're being remembered, and even though that's not fair, it is the way it is. And it would probably be tough to market a remastered collection of them today, and thusly, I don't really suspect we'll be seeing any kind of official revival of these games anytime soon. Sad to say, because I really like these games, but in this ADD hyperactive world we live in, I'm really not sure if there's much of a place for Crock right now. At this point, I'd give this game about a 20% chance of coming back. We just don't deserve Crock. A character that humanity does deserve, however, is Blasto. Captain Blasto is a bumbling 1960s style sci-fi hero guy who is essentially what you would get if you mixed Flash Gordon with Captain Kirk and Powdered Toast Man. He shoots aliens, he saves babes, and he throws out ridiculous catchphrases with the voice of late great Phil Hartman.
Grab a mop, there's gonna be guts on the ceiling.
And for all of that, I love him. The game wasn't particularly detailed, and the simplistic neon framework of the first few levels is something that might have seemed stale at the time, but I think a modernized version of this would actually look really interesting on 4K displays with HDR. That being said, the level design does get a little bit more mixed up as the game goes along, and you can sort of see the developers putting more effort into it as it goes along, which kind of made it an interesting experience. Now, there's really only two characters who matter in this game, the alien leader and Blasto himself. And just so we're clear, Sony, if you do decide to remaster Blasto, there's only two acceptable choices to voice these two characters. It's Richard Stephen Horvitz of Invader Zim and Angry Beavers fame, and Avery Brooks from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Filling Phil Hartman's shoes is definitely a tall order, but I think Brooks would be up to it. But if Avery turned you down, I would also accept Nick Offerman, although I'm not entirely sure why. And everybody pretty much hates this game but me, so I figure the chance of a remake is negative 0%. Speaking of games that nobody likes but me, I need to bring up Jersey Devil. This is one of the many totally decent games that never really got its moment in the spotlight because platformers were coming out every other day at the time, and I think Jersey Devil just sort of got lost in the shuffle. Kind of like Crock, Jersey Devil leaned into the limitations of the PS1 with simple level designs and simple characters, and because of that, I think its visuals actually have aged quite a bit better than something else like, say, Nightmare Creatures or ODT. But it also had its own twist on things with a slightly darker, sort of Halloween themed aesthetic that almost sort of got close to what Medieval did, although Medieval did it way better. There are some legitimate issues with this game, like the controls being a little stiff and the gliding feeling way heavier and slower than it probably should have, but these are things that could easily be fixed in a remake. I honestly believe that if this game got a few tweaks like that and a visual facelift, a lot of people would love it. However, I'm not going to get my hopes up for that. I think I'd have to give Jersey Devil a very sad 10% chance of a remake. Clock Tower is not just one of my favorite horror games or just one of my favorite PS1 games. Clock Tower is quite simply one of my favorite games of all time. And I don't think I'm alone on that. A lot of people in the horror community, especially those of us that are a little bit up there in age, will agree that this game stands out even today with its special blend of dialogue scenes, detective work, and pure controller gripping terror. Lots of horror games have drawn inspiration from Clock Tower over the years, and many of the games claim to be spiritual successors, and a lot of those games are fantastic. But the truth is, none of them will ever quite stack up to the outstanding journey into madness that is Clock Tower on the PS1. And yes, I know there is a Japan-only prequel of Clock Tower on the Super Famicom, and technically that's the first game in the series, but we're not talking about that right now. Even though the characters are only voiced at certain times in the game, and most of the dialogue is just text, For some reason, their personalities just shine through so effortlessly, and I think if the game were to get that remaster facelift, it would really turn out well. It's fair to say that Silent Hill and Resident Evil are bigger franchises and more influential in just about every way. And that's probably why we're far more likely to see more remakes and sequels in those franchises than we are Clock Tower. But I still think Sony needs to give Clock Tower a real chance. I like to think of Clock Tower's role in the survival horror genre this way. If the most important survival horror games were a family, and Resident Evil and Silent Hill were the parents, and Outlast and Amnesia were the children, Clock Tower would be that kooky uncle who rarely comes around for holiday dinners, but when he does come around, he gets drunk and makes everybody uncomfortable with long, unsolicited rants about ancient aliens and 9/11. The kooky uncle certainly isn't everybody's cup of tea, but there's no denying that he adds a certain spice to the family, and if it weren't for him, the family just wouldn't be the same. I do go back and play this game every once in a while, and every time I do, I'm shocked all over again with how rough it looks. Out of all the games on this list, Clock Tower probably needs that visual facelift the most. I'd leave pretty much all of the gameplay and dialogue alone as much as possible though. It's a great game underneath its exterior. And you know, I have a hunch that the odds of this game getting remastered or remade one day aren't as bad as you might think. With all of the interest in old horror games that the success of the Resident Evil 2 remake has generated, I'd be surprised if somebody somewhere wasn't looking into remaking Clock Tower right now. That doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but I'd say we have a solid 45% chance, and I think a lot of people would welcome it if it were announced. It just won't be anytime soon. Well, those are just a few of the games that I think would make fun remasters or remakes for Sony to do. Obviously, I think some of them would work because they would sell well, and some of them I just really want to see for my own selfish reasons, but regardless, there's no doubt that the PlayStation catalog is full of great candidates for this. And there's plenty of others that I didn't mention on this list, so let me know what games you think would be great picks for Sony to remaster in the comments. I think it's largely up to us to keep talking about stuff like this if we really want to see it come to fruition. So keeping that in mind, I'll probably do a part 2 of this at some point, so any ideas for that are welcome. But until then, thanks for watching.